I'm sorry, I'm just getting this thing activated here. We've taken a look in previous sessions at just an introduction to wilderness stewardship advocacy. We've looked at the kind of the basics of what stewardship advocacy looks like in talking with agencies and with congressional offices. We took a deep dive into how to actually talk to a congressional office, how to interact with their staff, how to set up a meeting with a member. And we've got all of those recorded on our previous sessions. They're all posted on the NWSA website, so that if you were unable to make one of the earlier webinars, you're free to go and look at that at your leisure as we kind of create a historical record and some documentation to go back to for others in the future. And today we're focusing in on what we call the ask. So it's one thing to just meet with your congressional representatives and your agency folks. It's another entirely different thing to have something specific that you want to ask them about. And so we're going to dive into the specifics today of what that ask should look like. And let me go ahead and share our screen. And we'll get started here. One second. All right. So with me today, do some introductions first. The workers on this presentation, so to speak, we have Anders Reynolds from the Southern Environmental Law Center, have Andrew Downs from the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. Andrew also serves as the board chair for the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance. Have Bill Hodge, who is the executive director for the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation, and myself, Randy Wells, the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance. Through our past experience in working with agency and congressional leadership, we hope to share some of the specific things about wilderness stewardship advocacy and the ask. And just as a reminder, I'd like to throw this slide in just to remind us about what wilderness stewardship advocacy is really all about. And it's about sharing information about those places that we love with the people who can make a difference, with a specific intention to make improvements in how they are managed. You want to make sure that you have something specific in mind as we move forward. And that's really what the ask is, that specific intention to make something better. So today, as we look at the ask, we're going to kind of dive into what is an ask, who's involved, what kinds of asks are there, how do you make that ask, and then what do you do after the ask? And we hope to have some examples, share some stories, and then we're going to ask each of you as participants to share one or two asks that you might have with your agency or congressional leadership. We're going to have you do that later by typing into the chat function what that specific ask would be. And we're going to want you to take what you hear in the next 30 minutes or so and incorporate that into how you write out your asks. And then we'll provide some feedback on what we think we can do to improve those particular asks and do some, one-on-one or back and forth so that we can help improve what we're asking our congressional and agency leaders for. So let's go ahead and dive in on what is an ask. And we'll turn this over to our three panelists. Each of you guys take a little bit turn on adding to what we're talking about an ask. So Anders, do you want to go first, then Bill, and then Andrew, or any order you guys want to jump in is fine.
Anders always cuts in line anyway, so he might as well go ahead and go first. So Well, the way I approach these kind of things, and I think I mentioned this on an earlier call, is I was raised in a Christian household, and we learned a lot about the Beatitudes in the New Testament. And for me, there's a whole new set of Beatitudes when you're on the hill. And those are 8 sort of guidelines you use when you're coming up with how a meeting should work and what your ask should be. And those 8 things are to be ready, to be aware of your size, to be political, to be pithy, to be curious, to be responsive, to be memorable, and to be grateful. So some of the bullet points you see on this slide match that sort of framework that I'm suggesting you work under. When you request an action, to walk through these, you do want to request one that is realistic. If your member is not, a committee chair, or if they don't have wilderness in their district, or if they're completely unaware of your program, you're going to have to do some extra work. And that may start with making an ask that is a little bit more tailored to where they are in their own career. You want to make a request that is timely. If it's appropriation season, you want to make an appropriations request. If it's authorization season, you want to make an authorizations request. If it's time to write a farm bill, you want to make a farm bill request. You don't want to necessarily meet with members and say, hey, we want to change something in USDA policy. It's going to take the farm bill to do it. And they just passed the farm bill 5 months ago. The members is going to be completely disinterested in engaging. Tailored to your audience, obviously, is one that you need to know. Who are the interest groups, or who are the constituencies in the members' district that really move them? I think we have on one of these calls before used the example of Bill going to Phil Rowe and sort of using Phil's interest in Veterans Affairs to sort of make a backdoor ask about protecting public lands. Requesting an action that supports the respondent. This is really about matching your request to the member's reelection concern. Every member is thinking about reelection unless they've announced retirement. And it's good to know which constituencies they think are most important for that reelection. And it helps if you come in and have a support that sort of matches that constituency. And finally, like the bullet says, the request should be, relevant to you. Don't just go in and ask for the sake of going in. Go in and ask something that could really change things for the better for your organization. And I would offer, just as like a follow-up, a caveat to that, if they say no, ask why. You don't have to, be rude about it. You don't have to say, well, why not? You can just be like, oh, okay, well, what would interest you? What are you interested in? Where can we find common ground? Because you might be surprised by the answer. I'll shut up, Bill. You can go next in line.
I would say Anders' really good list of Beatitudes for the Hill also apply to meeting with the agency. And I don't care if that's meeting with the agency at a district level, at a forest level, at a regional level, or at a Washington level. The one thing I would add that I would emphasize in the ask is it needs to have some specific components to it. Don't just ask for more support for the wilderness program. Ask for something specific you would like to see. An example would be, it could be you're trying to hold off something as an example. Recently, many groups were involved in asking the agency to reconsider their decision of eliminating the position of the director of wilderness and wild and scenic rivers. We felt that was a bad idea to not have the wilderness and wild and scenic rivers program have its own directorate at the Washington level. That's a specific ask. Do not eliminate that position. Or a specific ask could be asking senior leadership to consider something that goes back to resembling off the top programs. Without getting in the weeds too much, a lot of our wilderness programs through the years have been funded with off the top funds that were held at the Washington level specifically for the wilderness program, and then doled out sort of through internal grants. Off the top funding is now been going away and really gone away now in this new budget modernization process. And a specific ask might be to say, we would like to see those sorts of funding models returned because they guarantee funding at a ground level for the wilderness program, which can often get lost. So be specific about the ask, and yet while being specific, be flexible. And again, whether this is a specific ask of a member of Congress or an ask of the administrative branch, have your ask in mind, but also be flexible if they come up with a better solution to get to the same end goal. So just that's the one thing I want to add is be specific, but also be flexible. Andrew, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, thanks. I'll just add a couple things that these guys haven't touched on. I think first is have a problem. I mean, be really clear with the reason that you're making an ask, and maybe, be ready to give some thought about what happens if you don't take action. I think as you develop the problem you're trying to solve or issue you're trying to address, make sure it's a legislative solution that's required. A lot of times, you may think that the legislative path is the easiest, and it may be, but if there's already policies, procedures in place to at least address your problem, then the member may be reluctant to engage on a legislative solution. So be ready to clearly state the problem you're addressing and why a legislative solution is desirable. I think also as you go into this, I think it's worthwhile imagining that somebody also meeting with the member that you're meeting with is maybe asking for something almost exactly opposite, right? Or diametrically opposed in some way. And so I think Anders and Bill touched on this a little bit, but you've got to go into this with a willingness to collaborate and a willingness to kind of meet the member halfway, so to speak, if they need to adjust sort of goal structure to where they're more comfortable. So be flexible and be partnership oriented instead of kind of focused on drawing lines in sand through this process. But definitely be ready to be able to articulate a problem and then express clearly why a legislative solution is the desirable one.
One other thing I would add is think about your ask in the context of other parties. Even if it's a specific ask for a specific wilderness in which you work, I bet there are other parties that have an interest in that, and make sure you've not only thought that through, but discussed that with those other parties. A great example of that would be the National Forest Trail System Stewardship Act, which I had the great honor of getting to work with Randy Rasmussen, who's on here, and so many other of our backcountry horsemen friends and friends at the Wilderness Society, and got a piece of legislation passed through 2016 because multiple interest parties came together, and even though at the time when that bill passed, you would hear a lot of internal grumbling to the agency that it was an unfunded mandate. Quite frankly, it became the framework that helped steer the money from the Great American Outdoors Act funds to the right places and the right initiatives. So when you think about that ask, realize that you're not in a vacuum. Don't just think about the ask that it applies to your organization or your specific area of interest, but that it probably applies to others, and how you work on that together. So just that Trail Stewardship Act is a great example of that.
All right. I will just note that Anders typed in the Beatitudes that he mentioned earlier into the chat, so you can record them there, and they're recorded on the webinar. And Bill also mentioned the National Wilderness Wild and Scenic Rivers Director that the Forest Service had talked about consolidating. And I'm happy to report that as a result of our ask and other pressures that were brought to bear, the Forest Service has filled the Wild and Scenic River and Wilderness Director position with Katie Armstrong, just announced this morning. So pretty pleased to hear that, and we'll be looking forward to working with Katie in the days and weeks to come. I can say that I worked with Katie before when I was still within the agency in her time in legislative affairs, and she'll bring a good breadth of experience and a lot of energy to the position. So we'll look forward to working with Katie. So let's move on to the different types of asks that are out there. We've covered some of these before, but why don't we go ahead and guys talk a little bit about the type of asks that you've been involved in, the difference between a congressional ask and an agency ask, and maybe some examples that you would like to share. In no particular order.
Yeah, and I can start this one. So worked on a couple of different pieces of legislation recently around management of national scenic, national historic trails, the National Scenic Trail Viewshed Protection Act, the Pipeline Transparency and Fairness Act. And essentially what we were doing there is asking Congress to clarify how threats, external threats from development pressure are analyzed within the current NEPA system relative to national scenic and national historic trails. Basically saying our problem is that these types of resources don't fit well into the existing kind of NEPA systems that our federal agencies go through. So we'd like better clarification and guidance on how national scenic trails, impacts of national scenic trails are analyzed. So that was a fair amount of work, because I think as a group we were working with, we all had to make sure we had the same sort of basic understanding of the existing rules and regulations that are out there, how NEPA is conducted through a variety of federal agencies, how the AT and national scenic trails are managed, and then the nature of the FERC and federal regulatory systems over large infrastructure projects. So it's kind of a lot of baseline information collectively that we had to get on board and initially determine that there was a gap in specific to national scenic trails. So yeah, that was, I think, one of the more recent asks that I've been working on. A couple here and there, I think smaller time stuff, and then stuff at the state level as well. But those are the two most over the past couple years for me.
I could sort of stay in the middle here. I think they're clearly within Congress, that Andrews alluded to this earlier, there's sort of two different ways to make the ask. One is to get the ask done through an appropriations bill, and that can be as simple as wanting to move the needle on appropriations for the wilderness program, or use an appropriations as a way in which to influence policy. And then there can be the specific ask of asking the legislative branch to pass a law that changes sort of the work structure, work rules of the agencies themselves. Sometimes I'm just going to refer to it as the threat of action of the legislative branch can be what leads to action, even if that action is never completed on the legislative side. I would point to Bruce Bento's the bill back in the 90s that was attempt to get the Congress to wag their finger at the agencies that they weren't paying enough attention to the wilderness resource, and specifically the mandate to preserve wilderness character. And while that piece of legislation never passed, it did lead to the agencies coming together and forming the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute and the Arthur Carhart National Wilderness Training Center. And so the agencies responded by the threat of legislative action in that case. And so sometimes those two things work together. And sometimes the communication from those two different branches of government can be a little muddy. An example I would point to is on the appropriations front, as the Forest Service has specifically gone down this route of budget modernization and collapsing the number of accounts in which Congress appropriates dollars. I've heard the agency say that Congress asked for it, and I've heard the House Natural Resources Committee say that they never asked for the reduction in number of accounts. And sort of trying to get at the heart of it could be the ask, can we have clarity on how we got to the point where wilderness dollars are lumped in with so many other things that it's very easy for those dollars to get diluted by the time they get to the ground. So the ask could be specifically to clarify the difference in perceptions from the agency side or the congressional side of the appropriations process. Anders, anything you'd add to that?
No, the only thing I can do is agree with the two of you. I will say under congressional ask here, the first two bullet points, the first bullet point speaks to appropriations and the second two speak to authorization. But like Bill mentioned, there actually is a third type, and that's oversight. And sometimes having a good enough relationship with a member of Congress that they're willing to send a letter to one of the agencies, to USDA or to Interior, is enough to get those folks acting in the ways you want to act. And I think we'll talk about this later, but really the question you've got to ask yourself about these asks are, are we going to take a grassroots approach where we present ourselves as part of a large motivated group of people who are central to this member's reelection, or are we going to take a grass tops approach wherein we've got some really targeted VIPs, and this is more about the way the member views himself and their prestige. They don't want to disappoint some really critical supporters. So those are kind of the two ways of approaching all three of those asks.
All right, and I would just mention an example how NWSA in our early days realized that there was great disparity in how the agency was handling volunteer workforces when it came to chainsaws and crosscut saws. And so we asked the agency to change their policy about the crosscut saw. And it took us several years to get that done, but we're happy that, over the last several years, we've now had a new updated crosscut chainsaw policy that's allowed the volunteers to do both training and certification and see a lot more hands on the ground than what we had previous to that new policy. So just another example of how groups can really work effectively together to make substantive change.
Hey, Randy, I wanted to sort of address Lisa's question, which I think is an appropriate one. I don't know if I can answer it correctly. I think whenever we've identified a real need is when. So her question is when were our requests for congressional research reports appropriate as an information finding technique? As an example, if the Wild and Scenic River community wants to know how much money is being spent by agencies and Wild and Scenic Rivers within an agency budget, I think that's an incredibly important question, Lisa, and I think it's an important one. I mentioned the National Forest Trail System Stewardship Act. That all began with a request for a congressional report that the Wilderness Society and Backcountry Horse of America asked for the General Accounting Office to ask the Forest Service to account for how much of their trail system was maintained to standard, which I think was 16%, was the number that ultimately came back. And so I'm not sure I have the right answer. I know what my answer would be, which is now, whether it's Wild and Scenic Rivers or Wilderness. I think now is the time to say not only how much is the agency spending on fixed costs, staff, but how are they also spending non-fixed costs on the Wilderness and Wild and Scenic River programs. And how are they leveraging their shared knowledge to do that together? Because that also feels like it's slowly falling apart as well. But I'm curious what anybody else is, whether on the panel or not on the panel, what anybody else has answered Lisa's question is. Randy Rasmussen, you were part of that ask of the General Accounting Office, which did lead to a piece of legislation, which, again, while it didn't have teeth at the time, it became a vehicle for how the Great American Outdoors Act money would be spent.
Oh, indeed. And yeah, I mean, and the reason to ask for the government to do the study is because we could generate our own numbers, the Wilderness Society, BCHA, and others, about what we think the Forest Service is doing. But when it's coming from the GAO and a government source that Congress trusts, you know, that's using the data. Of course, that pulls the Forest Service into the discussion process and having to provide data to get to that report. No, I take that back. That wasn't quite the way it went down, but no, it was a GAO report ultimately that showed those shortcomings. And of course, the problem there was, at least at the time, the thought was that the Forest Service just is going to have to tailor their trails program to match their inadequate funding. That clearly isn't the answer that we wanted. But yeah, with opportunities like the Great American Outdoors Act and others, that blueprint was created. And it had a secondary benefit too, because the Forest Service, much as Bill suggested before, started initiating their own actions even before that bill ultimately passed in 2016, and they started creating their trail strategy that laid out, and they did their own internal review of how, because Leslie Wald and others at the time said we were embarrassed by that GAO report. We admitted the truth, and now we got to do something about it, irrespective of whether that bill passed. So that wall pushed things in the right direction for a good result.
And for clarity, I'll just note that there are two particular processes. One would be using the General Accounting Office to do a particular detailed report. The other would be the Congressional Research Service. In both cases, you're going to need to have a congressional sponsor who makes those requests. The GAO and the Congressional Research Service won't respond from a general public inquiry. It takes a member of Congress to make a specific request that will then go through a vetting process to determine the priority of that request versus all the other requests that are coming in. And so the more congressional support you can build for such an inquiry, the better the chance it will have of actually being implemented and then activated. But they can be effective ways to call the agency into account and to ask detailed questions and get behind the scenes of information that wouldn't readily be available. Well, let's move on here to some other consideration.
Randy,
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, can I just add real briefly to that? The GAO reports are all searchable online at the GAO's website. Congressional Research Service reports are a little harder to come by. You can get them via a friendly congressional office. They have access to all of them, and they're usually happy to forward them to you. There's also a website. I'm going to double check before I put it in the chat, but I'm pretty sure it's called Open Secrets, which is sort of like a wiki that puts all the CRS reports up. There's usually some lag time. They're not updated daily, but usually every month or so, you'll find all the newest reports, and you can search them by title and subject. And sometimes it's good to know when the last CRS report on a particular item came out, because if it's been, a decade, it's easier to make the argument that perhaps a member of Congress ought to request a new one. So I'll double check on that and share it with you.
Yeah,
one
other thing I want to just highlight back to, Randy started this out with, we've had at least 2, maybe 3 prior webinars on this topic. And in one of those earlier ones, I emphasized something I want to emphasize again real quick. So if you're, I think Lisa's question is a great example of having a specific ask, like, hey, I'd like to know what are the agencies actually spending and how are they spending their money on the Wild and Scenic Rivers program. That's a very specific ask. But in the earlier webinar I brought up, if you have a relationship at the Washington office level with the Forest Service, as an example, or BLM or the Park Service or Fish and Wildlife, they shouldn't be caught off guard that you go ask for either one of those entities to make that that study, to do that analysis, just like any other ask. If you have a relationship, even if they feel like they've given you enough answer, you go, I really don't think I have enough clarity, so I don't want you to be caught off guard. I am going to ask for, and if I can find the right congressional support for this report to be done, or for this piece of legislation that calls the agency to task for managing it, because there's no bigger way to burn a deep relationship with the agency than to then be caught off guard with an action that they didn't know was coming from a partner in this case. So just want to emphasize from one of the earlier webinars. Sorry, Randy.
You bet, no problem. So as our team was talking about the ask and what we wanted to include, we developed a list of these considerations, items that everybody should be thinking about, and that kind of flavor how the who, when, how, why the ask is done. So guys, would you speak to some of these? Again, it doesn't matter the order, but why are they important, and what are some specific examples you'd like to share about why these are important considerations?
Yeah, and I can start here. Just using the Pipeline Transparency and Fairness Act. A couple of these jump out at me as key sort of bullets or items in that process. Ask for something realistic. So, we were talking to members of Congress. We were not asking them to shut down any specific project, right? That's something that even if they could do, I think they would probably be pretty reluctant to do. But what we were asking for is just some additional analysis, right? Understand the impacts from these projects. And so, we needed to be realistic in what these folks could actually not only provide under law, but to get behind. And so that was a key part of that. As well as being well informed, while I spoke a minute ago about a collective need to kind of establish a baseline of information around a variety of things that affected this legislation. Walking in there, I wanted to make sure that I knew as much as humanly possible about all these things before going in to the conversation. And so that was precedent on other infrastructure that crossed national scenic trails. That was histories of non-park service or forest service, federal NEPA going. I mean, there was a lot of different stuff that had to prepare for. And then we definitely had to be ready for follow-up. I mean, there was a lot to chew on through the first few meetings, and we would kind of collectively get together and talk through a bunch of stuff, and then the legislative aides would chew on it and get back to us with tweaks, changes, sometimes pretty significant ones, and we had to be responsive to that, flexible to those needs and interests as partners, and then really responsive. So just pulling out a couple of those bullet points that from my experience are really, really important. I think ask for something realistic is one of the most important ones on there, and something to keep in mind. You're not asking for a silver bullet every time. Most of the time you're asking just for like these incremental advances towards your end goal.
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about the knowing your audience piece of it. One, if you go back to one of our earlier webinars about what is advocacy and what you need to be aware, again, if you're unsure about how much role you can take in advocacy, you should go back and watch the earlier webinars in terms of not jeopardizing your 501c3 status if you're working for a nonprofit, but also how advocacy is a very specific, lobbying is a very specific definition, and so just be aware of that. But I just want to sort of give some anecdotal examples of knowing your audience. This is not related to a stewardship bill, but in working to pass the Tennessee Wilderness Act, which passed in December of 2018, getting to the first sponsor of that piece of legislation turned out to be as simple as knowing that Senator Lamar Alexander really wanted to meet with a guy named Will Skelton, who is just a conservationist based in Tennessee, but had written the Cherokee hiking guide, and had asked Lamar to write the foreword to it. And I think that was one of like the early important piece, was knowing that having Will Skelton in the meeting with Senator Alexander was going to mean something to Senator Alexander was important. Now, you're not always going to have access to that kind of information, but sometimes you will, and you should absolutely take advantage of it. Knowing, Anders referred to later on in that legislative piece, knowing that that Congressman Rowe was a veteran, and that he was chair of the Veterans Committee. While that didn't have anything to do with the wilderness bill, we were able to connect Congressman Rowe with the Persals program, having a partnership with the United States Naval Academy, and actually got Congressman Rowe out on the ground in this area that we were looking to protect, and meet a Naval Academy crew that was doing wilderness trail work at the time. So understanding that member of Congress, or understanding that the person that works for the agency or works for the department, is pretty important in establishing rapport, but it also can be important in establishing connection to the actual ask that you're making. And never make an assumption that they're not well informed on the topic. If they're not, that's okay. You can fill them in, but be careful to come in and sort of talking down to the member or even the member's staff. They may be very, very versed on the subject, and you should start with some baseline questions of understanding how deeply they understand the topic as it may be.
Hey, I just want to double down on that last thing Bill just said. Ask questions first, read your audience. Don't assume they don't know anything, man. That'll keep you from walking into the same trap that I've walked into a few times. So that's really good advice. Yeah, and I'll second it. Sorry, Anders, go ahead.
No problem. Yeah, I was gonna say, I think for me, all this boils down to the one beatitude about being curious. That means before the meeting, during the meeting, and after the meeting. You should be curious about who you're meeting about. Ask the point of contact. Are we going to be seeing the member? Is this going to be a staff member? What does the staff member cover? Is it the chief of staff, the LD, one of the legislative assistants? I think during the meeting, it's good to be curious. It's good to ask, how much do you know about this? Have you seen this landscape for yourself? Or have you ever had a experience working on something like this? Or, where were you before you were in this member's office? Do you have any experience? I think it's good to ask clarifying questions. If they say, we've got concerns about X, Y, or Z, you can say, well, what would help meet those concerns, or what more information do you need? He's not on this call, but I think a lot of people know him. Kevin Colburn from American Whitewater. He's one of the very, very best at asking questions to members and congressional staff. He does it with a smile on his face. He's just very good at being like, well, what information do you need? And then getting it to them. He's a very curious guy, and he likes to solve the puzzle of legislative success. And that continues after the meeting too. It's following up, saying like, hey, were you able to speak to the LD about this? Were you able to speak to the member? Would you like to come down and see this area? Whatever the question may be. It also involves, being curious about what groups do we think this member would like to see come in with us as we meet, and what groups might alarm him if they came in with us, because that's the real politic in most of these situations, is that you've got to understand who's perceived as an ally and who's perceived as a threat. Randy, I see your question about being pithy. My big example about this is, I think oftentimes people, especially if we have lobby days or lobby weeks, we'll take in, and I'm as guilty as this as anybody, we'll take in 10 folks to meet a member of Congress, and each person introduces himself and tells a personal story. And I think that's very moving to us, but it ends up taking 45 minutes of the hour we have. I think sometimes it's more powerful just to find the 3 people in the meeting who we think are going to be most impactful in that particular meeting, having them introduce people generally and jump right into the meat of the matter. I think having worked on the Hill, I can tell you a lot of times people spend, 60 to 70% of their meeting introducing themselves without ever getting to the ask itself. And I think it's always good to be as pithy as possible, to leave things unsaid rather than to say too much. I'll also add one of my tricks. I think I mentioned this before on an earlier one. One of my tricks is to the very last question they ask is to say, I don't know, even if you do know, and then to ask for their contact information so you can follow up. It's a good way to get a personal email address or a personal phone number and to start establishing that relationship so that not only did they experience a good meeting with you, but they experienced good follow-up, and they've already got in the back of their mind, oh, this is the kind of person that's going to get me information if I ask. Like, I can trust them to be honest and get me this timely. It's especially powerful if you happen to know the answer and you can just wait a few hours and email them and say, hey, I got this for you. And they'll be like, oh, they really prioritized me this afternoon. That makes me feel great. So it costs you nothing to do. It costs you a little bit to say, I don't know in the moment, but it pays off big time in the long run.
Yeah, one thing I'd add on the what to do when they say yes, what to do when they say no. There's an old adage is in the sales world, when somebody says yes, that's your cue to shut up. And that is very true here too. When somebody says, yes, I'd be interested in sponsoring your legislation, or yes, I'd interested in taking the lead on, whatever your ask might be, that is really time to sort of wrap things up. Now, Anders gave a great example of Kevin Colburn being very good about being curious. There are obviously steps that are generally going to happen. If the first meeting goes so well that they say yes, there's going to be follow-up steps to be had. But do learn to shut up and don't complicate things after somebody says yes, they're interested in your topic. Yes, they're interested in the ask that you have. And when they say no, ask them if they know somebody that might be interested in supporting what you're asking for.
Or what would change their mind? What else do they need to see?
Sure. I mean, you never want to give up on them. And we, in several examples I've given, we didn't give up on people, and occasionally you do have to give up and move on. But sometimes it obviously depends on the no, but the no might be just because they've got so many other legislative balls in the air that they just don't want to hop on another piece of legislation yet, but they still believe in it, and they may know a fellow member who would be very passionate about the topic. So a no is just a step towards a future yes. So a little cliche, little salesman speak. It's very true.
All right, that's great. I just wanted to add that none of this should be done in a vacuum, because it is true that there's strength in numbers. So the more partners and coalitions, the groups that you can bring together to make the ask together, the better off you are. And they don't all have to be in the meetings, but when you can have support letters, position letters that are signed off on by a large group of people, I think that does carry weight with folks. And so the more people that they know are behind something, the more likely you are to get some traction. Before we move to the next slide, is there anything else that you guys would like to say about saying yes or no? Because that does generally mean some follow-up as intended.
A hard and fast rule of congressional staff, I don't know if it holds true for agency staff, but of congressional staff, is that they love maps, and the bigger the map is, the better. They go crazy over them. It works every time. It doesn't mean they're going to say yes to what you do, but it will definitely get their attention. They're a very weird group of people.
I think a lot of us on this webinar share a common friend in Rob Mason, and he travels with a huge bundle of maps every time he goes to DC, because the Idaho delegation certainly loves looking at huge maps of Idaho.
They're a lot less threatening than a crosscut.
Hey, that worked. Me carrying a crosscut worked.
Oh, I know.
All right. Well, let's take a moment here and see if there are some other examples of previous asks that we want to share. And kind of incorporate some of the thoughts that we've had so far. And I've just got 3 examples up here. Just one example about dealing with legislative appropriations. I think the Partnership for the National Trail System has had an outstanding example using their gold sheet, which, if you're not familiar with it, that's a representation of the volunteer hours and the value of those volunteer hours to the public for the trail work that's been done by the National Scenic Historic Trail System folks. And along with that, each year they put in a specific authorization, appropriation request to the appropriators, and they're asking for a set amount of money for National Scenic Historic Trails. And I think they've been very successful over the years of securing that amount and adding to it over time in each of their requests each year during Hike the Hill. I think it's a pretty good standard for all of us to look towards. Another example that's real recent is the GAO efforts. Randy, if you want to join us here too, Bill, you guys were involved in sharing our thoughts about including wilderness stewardship groups into the mix of projects that would be considered for GAO money. That we're now in like our 3rd year or 2nd year of the Great American Outdoors funding. You guys want to share any particular tidbits about our asks there?
I think the one thing I would say is that GAOA was actually going to be ROPA, and which was the Restore Our Parks Act, and it was literally just going to be funding for the Park Service deferred maintenance program. And a lot of groups, and I would applaud those who put on Hike the Hill, came together to say, look, this should be all public lands, and that evolved over time to where it was going to be all DOI agency. All 3 DOI agencies involved, and then a lot of us were there and pretty loud about the inclusion of USDA and the Forest Service being a part of GAOA. And another example I would give, this also goes to the Trail Stewardship Act, is being willing to be vocal for your niche in the moment. I think there are many times that I would guess that the core world, the core network, those conservation core groups probably think I'm anti-core, but it's because oftentimes legislation like the Trail Stewardship Act or the Great American Outdoors Act, some groups who are much more organized, and let's say we are, and I just mean it from they've had a longer term to have a regular DC presence, can slip things into bills that would maybe specify that funding for GAOA would only be spent with core programs, as an example. And I am not bashful about saying it was going to take all programs to be able to catch up on the deferred maintenance on the trail system. And so let's make sure the legislation doesn't only specifically call out the core network, or doesn't specifically call out what I consider my organization, which is a place-based stewardship organization. It takes all, and don't be afraid about being an advocate for it, because you might be the only person advocating for that position, but it might be a pretty important position to take. So. And again, I'm pretty sure I've come off as anti-core over that, but it's just because they tend to be able to slip that language in all the time. And I think place-based programs that are not AmeriCorps-based programs are an equal part, or an equally important part of helping address stewardship needs, specifically in the wilderness program.
Anders, you want to mention any specific wilderness legislation that you've been working on here lately?
Yeah, I can. There's a couple of wilderness bills that are sort of either nascent or maybe a little bit more alive in the East. And I think they all represent good examples of the different paths these things can take. Probably the easiest, friendliest path we have right now is an effort to designate some scenic area around Shenandoah Mountain. It's a little donut of scenic area with wilderness in the middle. And because we're working with someone in Senator Tim Kaine, who has been through the wilderness process before, it's been relatively easy. He knows what wilderness is. He knows what goes into writing a bill. He's not afraid to introduce it. He's comfortable with the praise and the hate he gets when he does it. And it's just been a really easy and open process where you can be totally transparent with the staff member, and you always want to be transparent, but in this case, you can be particularly so. But you can juxtapose that to an effort right now in Arkansas to add some additional wilderness acres to the flat side wilderness in the Ouachita National Forest. That bill is being sponsored by a Republican congressman who, I guess about 4 years ago, went through a similar process to add even fewer acres to flat side. And at the time, I think there was a lot of consternation in the community because the bill was so small, and that's understandable. But the gamble that advocates were making down there was that, if you work with this sort of non-traditional champ who isn't from the, quote unquote, right party to do this thing and who had never done one before, if you invest in them a little and make them feel really good about a small bill, they may come back and do a bigger one. And that's exactly what's happening now. They felt so good about their experience 4 years ago that they've decided to do it again, despite the fact that they represent a sort of minority view in their state and in their party about protecting wilderness. And that process is much different than the one with Tim Kaine. This member is kind of listening to advocates, but also kind of going through and checking their homework and checking in with all the different stakeholders that were involved, making sure everyone's okay, really moving slowly. But that's just where they are. They're in a different spot, and they've had a different experience than Senator Kaine. And you can just juxtapose both those experiences with a really nascent one that may not take off in North Carolina to protect the Craggy Mountains as wilderness. It's something that's recommended in all, or maybe just most of the alternatives to the current forest plan there. That's not quite finalized, but advocates are approaching Senator Burr, who does have, some reputation as a conservationist, mostly through his championing of LWCF, and saying, hey, you're retiring next year. This would be a great legacy for you. Don't know who's coming after you. They may not be as good on this stuff. There's widespread local support, a bunch of folks who are connected to you support this. Don't you want to do it? And that coalition is leaning really heavily on VIPs that know Burr well, that have his cell phone number, that are able to call him and say, this is such a great idea, and it'd be a great way to leave Congress this year to have this sort of be your legacy. So, I mean, that just goes to show you that the end result in all those cases is sort of, very similar land protection for pretty similar landscapes, but the strategies and the processes surrounding them look very different based on the member, their comfort level, how they feel about different stakeholders, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it shows in each case some thoughtfulness by each group of advocates that are attempting to get it done.
All right. Well, in the time we have left to us, I want to do two things. If you have a specific question that you have for our panel, please go ahead, type it into the chat, and we'll queue those up. And then if you have a specific ask that you're interested in asking agency or congressional office, go ahead and type that in as well. And we'll have our panel give you some feedback about the specifics of your ask. And so be as specific as you can be in what you type in, and our panel will give you some thoughts about maybe how to approach that ask, things that you might consider as well. So please go ahead and type in any questions that you might have. And if you have a particular ask that you'd like to get some feedback about, take a minute and type those into the chat, and we will give you some feedback. While we're waiting for that to happen, if there's any final thoughts from our panel you'd like to share that we didn't quite cover?
I don't know, rose
Yes, make
garden
sure
attire.
What's that?
I said rose garden attire, after this is all done and, the president's going to be signing something in the rose garden. You got to make sure you're ready.
Yeah.
No, go ahead, Bill. What do you have?
No, I was just going to say, make sure you stay in touch. And this is a great role that NWSA plays, but make sure you stay in touch with others around the country, even on a one-on-one level. Mike Splain and I got to have a great chance to sit around the campfire together last week. It was impromptu, but it was fantastic. And to find out just exactly how much overlap there is between work he's doing now and work I'm in only comes from being able to have those moments. Can't always be around a campfire. I'm very thankful that was, but make sure you stay in touch with your colleagues around the country because there may be some important work going on you don't know about that may tie right back to what you're doing. So.
That's what we hope one of the important roles that NWSA can play in helping bringing people together to have those moments. I've got a question that has come up in terms of what do you think about the benefit and the value of providing something of substance back to somebody, a congressman or an agency, a gift or a memento once they've responded to your ask. What's your thoughts about doing something like that?
Well, I have two. One is I watched as I was walking into a congressman's office, somebody from an insurance lobby palmed $2,000 into the congressman's hands. So there is that way to go about it. But maybe a better, more appropriate example to give would be we were having a very challenging time getting back to the member, in this case, Senator Lamar Alexander on the Tennessee Wilderness Bill. We felt like we had gotten that early yes, and that they agreed to introduce the legislation, and they introduced that piece of legislation 5 times, but we weren't really sure that they were working it. And we also could never get back to him. And so we actually had created a Southern Wilderness poster for the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act, and we wanted to present it to the member, and it actually gave us a reason to have like 10 or 15 minutes with Senator Alexander to give him this framed poster for his office. And so probably the more appropriate way in which to recognize somebody. I know the Wilderness Society over the years has been big about giving awards to Congressional champions, which is a great way to get them to show up and mingle with the wilderness community. So just a couple of
Okay. So we have an ask from Mike Splain. So if you guys would look at the chat, what Mike is pointing out is, of course, we've got this big problem with the agencies of understaffing right now. Not enough staff to help support the wilderness actions that are needed, over-reliance on partners just for basic wilderness functions. And so his ask is to work with state delegation in requesting the appropriate sufficient dollars for a minimum set of staffing positions within the Forest Service units that contain wilderness. And how would we go about doing that? And I just point out that the Forest Service does have, or at one time did create an index about the staffing levels that would sort of meet a minimum requirement or a minimum standard for each particular wilderness area. And that might be something that we could tie back to. It probably needs to be updated because it's at least 10 years old. But what are your guys' thoughts about this sort of sufficient minimum set of staffing for Forest Service units?
This is what I was talking about that I got to sit around the fire and talk to Mike about, and Mike can unmute himself and talk a lot more about it. But if Mike was writing from New Hampshire, I would say, hey, why don't you include some other states? But since he's writing from California and an enormous state delegation and an enormous amount of public lands, it makes sense at that level that they're doing this state ask. But I think it is I think, Randy, your example of that minimum workforce baseline is something I would point to, because I've watched the agency that created it just decide to ignore it, or just not at least be internal advocates for meeting. And I've watched here in Region 1 an analysis done that said we have 50, according to the definitions of what that minimum workforce should be, Region 1 has 50% of the staff that we should have. And the staff officer above the Wild Scenic Rivers person said, that doesn't feel right to me. And that's where it ended, as opposed to the actual analysis, which was absolutely right. So I think sometimes you got to find your way around those people who aren't passionate enough advocates, or maybe even not even advocates at all in this case, even though they happen to have Wilderness Wild Scenic Rivers fall in their portfolio, to work around them if you have to get to the people who, if you choose to use that minimum workforce baseline, because my guess, and my and I didn't get to this detail, is I bet it's not being met in California. It's certainly not being met here in Region 1. So finding those who need to hear it, even if the locals don't want to advocate for it.
Mike, thinking about
Yeah.
your state and your delegation and who's on HNRC, just totally spitballing. I don't know how they'd react at all. It might be interesting to go to Katie Porter, who's now the chair of the Oversight Subcommittee on House Natural Resources Committee, and see if she wants to do an oversight hearing about this, to call in agency staff and say, hey, have you noticed this problem? Are you trying to keep pace? What's the issue here? Because from the outside, it appears like we've got all these problems, but the fair way to say is, I want to give you the time to answer them if you think there's not a problem. The Oversight Subcommittee on HNRC is a relatively new tool we have, and I don't think we really know how to use it yet. But we've got a fantastic advocate there in terms of Katie Porter and this particular committee. I wonder if her staff would be curious about this.
And the mention of that index is intriguing, because I didn't know that existed. That would give you something to compare to. I mean, that's,
it was created by the Wilderness Information Management and the Wilderness Advisory Groups, probably back first part of the 2000s. We went through a workforce planning process and tried to come up with, again, the amount of people that it would take to actively manage wilderness areas. And then it was created into an index, and all the wilderness areas in the system at the time were kind of given a rating, A, B, C, D, E, and then an index of people was associated with that particular level. I'm not sure if they're still using it, or I think it's still embedded in the workforce management wilderness stewardship performance element. But
It was absolutely
be
used in this analysis that Jimmy did for Region 1. He used that index, and it said that we have 50% of the workforce for the wilderness program in Region 1 that we should have. And his boss said, it feels like we already got too many people working in the Bob as it is. And it just became literally an anecdotal response to a scientific analysis, if you will. And so far, the anecdotal response is winning the day, because it's like a filter point. It's like a pinch point.
well, just real quickly, the reason I posted that long ass question was because of Randy Rasmussen's comment about that HR 5341. That really came out of conversations I had when I was back at VWA with Panetta's staff. And he's very, very much fire oriented, not so much wilderness oriented. But it's the same idea. There should be a baseline set of staff positions that are filled, and you can authorize that. But to get the appropriators to say, here's this money, you have to use it for this baseline set of positions, I think would be valuable. So.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think we could, maybe we could sponsor a working group to take a look at that and do some refreshing from a partner standpoint as to what that looks like.
I mean, it would be really powerful, the work that Mike's doing in California, but in general, for all of us to be doing that work about them having the workforce that they need. Because I think we all know there's also some who still hold on to the idea that we're replacing agency employees with partners. And if they saw the partner community being even more vocal about the capacity of the agency, I think could put that to bed once and for all, that we're not here to replace the federal workforce. We're here to just be the icing on the cake, to be the value add, not the instead of.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we have reached our time limit, folks, and time to draw this to a close. I want to thank our panelists for their great insight into what an ask is all about, and to thank them again for their insight in this whole series of webinars that we've been doing on wilderness stewardship advocacy. Again, these will all be available on the NWSA website for referring to, and hopefully it'll be a historical document that we can build upon as we move forward. Again, our overall goal is to recreate what once was a Wilderness Week experience back in Washington, D.C. We had hoped to do that this year with the National Wilderness Workshop, but since we're moving to a virtual format, we're going to try to bring some members of Congress and congressional committees to the workshop, and that's still in the works. So if you haven't yet signed up for the National Wilderness Workshop, that's your next chance to interact with Wilderness Stewardship Advocacy, coming up November 15th through the 19th. You can check out the latest information on our NWSA website. And I'll say that there'll be some updates to the agenda this week based on some current changes. And so will still be opportunity and time to get in on the early bird registration through the end of the month for the National Wilderness Workshop. So again, thanks again to our team, and thank you all for attending and participating, and we'll just draw this to a close. Any final thoughts or comments from our panelists?
Thanks for being here.
Well,
Appreciate you guys.
Yep, thanks everybody. Thanks for all the work you're doing for wilderness stewardship around the country. With that, well, this is Randy Welsh signing off from NWSA.